modern US can feel extremely politically polarizing, as is the nature of a bipartisanship where you're literally just giving people two poles to pick from: north, south, west, east, red, blue. And with social reform being such a hot ticket issue in today's political landscape, it can feel like voting for Republicans is choosing to oppress people, while voting for Democrats is calling for social justice. It wasn't always like this, though. There was a time when the Democratic Party was the pro-slavery Confederate Party, and the Republican Party felt like the only voice for Black people, considering they literally could not vote. So what happened in the past 150 years to cause such a massive ideological switch of the two parties? Like most things in this country, including what the foundation of the US itself is, the short answer to this question is race. From the racialized beginnings of the Republican Party to the boom of dog whistle politics, we'll be going over the extremely race-based 180 of both the Democratic and Republican Party. Before we have any idea where we're going, we've got to know where we've been. And the best place to start would be the formation of the Republican Party itself, since it was formed on the basis of slavery. During the reign of the second party system in America, pre-GOP, the bipartisanship was divided between the Democratic and the Whig Party. At this point, there wasn't a distinct line in the sand on each party's views on slavery. The main difference on that issue between the two parties is whether or not they were open about being pro-slavery. What I mean by that is there were plenty of anti- and pro-slavery politicians on each side, but while the Democratic Party made it known that they were white supremacists, the Whig Party kind of turned into a secret society in a lot of ways for the pro-slavery politicians, leading to the party splintering and the Democrats dominating the election cycles. The uneasy tension between pro- and anti-slavery politicians in the North and the South intermixing within political parties would quickly come to a head when Democratic Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, much to the dismay of the North, since it essentially did away with the Missouri Compromise. The North, frustrated by the South seemingly having all the power in Congress, came together from both former Democrats and Whigs to form the Republican Party, and while it originally had trouble gaining traction, the party's first golden boy was about to enter: Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln would gain a lot of attention for the Republican Party by battling for a spot as Illinois Senator with none other than the man who catalyzed the creation of the Republican Party, Douglas. And while Lincoln lost his spot as senator to Douglas, he would end up becoming the first ever Republican president in the election of 1860, easily one of the most insane presidential elections. With 3 separate political parties and 4 candidates, the pre-Civil War tension and divisions were extremely evident. Lincoln ran as the Republican Party's candidate. The former Whigs who wished to return to the moderate tension from before formed the Constitutional Union Party and ran John Bell, and the Democratic Party ran with 2 candidates, John C. Breckinridge and Douglas. With 4 candidates running and a nation divided, Lincoln only won 40% of the popular vote that year. This election perfectly encapsulates the starting point for these two parties as they moved into the third party system, with the line between Republican and Democratic states matching up perfectly with the free and slave states. This is how the parties will generally remain until we start heading into the 20th century. The new Republican Party tries its best to start further reforming the country during the Reconstruction era, though they do fail to bring meaningful change to the Black community. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party remains solidly anti-Black for most of the rest of this century, opposing Reconstruction-era legislation vehemently and pushing segregation laws like their lives depended on it. This would start to change at the turn of the century, when global turmoil was at its highest in ages, and crisis after crisis in the U.S. would lead to unrest in the two political parties that would start sowing the seeds of change. Up until the 1930s, the Black vote would always lean towards the Republican Party, which makes a lot of sense. The Republican Party was the party of the Union that at least attempted to build up civil rights during the Reconstruction era. As for the Democratic Party, they were the party of the Confederacy that was pro-segregation. and anti-policing legislation, such as the anti-lynching bill. Their trust in the Republican Party would soon start to wear thin. Since the Republican Party was the Northern Party, they had a lot of stake in industry. This meant they would get super rich during the technological revolution, and money has this funny way of corrupting people and distancing them from the working class they used to support. So the Republican Party started leaning towards the moneybags party, not just by failing to care about the oppressed groups of society, many Republicans claiming they had done enough to help black people, but also by beginning to focus on economic policies, which, also disenfranchises the oppressed groups of society. Like, Theo, I appreciate you promoting workers' rights, but when you go with a raising all the boats mentality, you're giving them the same amount of water to boats that are floating happily and the boats that are washed up on shore. Hey, God?
Oh, hey down there.
Hey, you have that water there? Do you think you can maybe help me out a bit and pour some water down on me? My boat's beached right now and I can't get it into the ocean.
Sure, here you are.
That, didn't really do anything. I guess I could get it into the water now, but it would take a lot of work. I don't know what to tell you. I only have so much water here that I can give. Well, you gave water to that guy over there. He was fine before, and I wasn't. Why didn't you just give all the water to me? Listen, man, give me a break. I'm an equal God, not an equitable one. Okay, then. I guess I'll have to unbeach this boat by myself now. At least he's better than his predecessor, since William McKinley was pure just a big business kiss-up. Of course, not everyone was like this. Both political parties desired to go back to the way things were for their party, one way or another. A good chunk of the Republican Party still desired to support civil rights, and a good chunk of the Democratic Party still desired to oppress black people. We'll get to those liberal Republicans later, but let's start by looking at those Dixiecrats. During FDR's administration, which we'll get more in depth with later, it became increasingly obvious to the part of the Democratic Party that was stuck in the old days that the loud majority of the party wasn't going to let them have their way. This anger towards the Democratic Party for continuously supporting black people and their rights came to a head when they were unable to prevent Harry Truman from being the presidential nominee for the Democratic Party. With that nomination, they broke off from the party to form the States' Rights Democratic Party, or the Dixiecrats, nominating J. Storm Thurmond. The idea of the party wasn't to win, but rather get enough of the country, or rather the South, to give them electoral votes, to put the country in a deadlock, since they had enough members in the House of Representatives to prevent any of the nominees from winning until they agreed to not act on any of their civil rights promises. Because that seems like a super great idea, holding the government hostage until one of the nominees is like, okay, fine, I'm racist now. Their plan wouldn't work, but their message clearly resonated with a certain group of people, with 4 of the 5 solid South states voting for Thurmond, and 98.8% of his votes coming from the South. They would still be solidly Democratic for the next couple of decades, but it's clear that their stubbornness to just get back to the way things were, and their political stubbornness are starting to butt heads. The party disbanded after the election, and while some crawled back to their original party, most either went independent or Republican, such as the apparent golden boy of the Dixiecrats, Thurmond, but we'll get to that Republican conversion later after we talk about more of the Democratic conversion. Pre-Great Depression, most of the country had no reason to vote for the Democratic Party and plenty to vote for the Republican Party. Not only were they the party of civil rights, but they were also a heavily agrarian party, making them appealing to the working class pre-technical revolution. But then the working class and black people started moving towards industry, and the Democrats started working hard on on urbanization and revitalization, shifting to fit the new working class. That and Herbert Hoover's horrible stance on dealing with the Great Depression, which would lead to his, and by extension the Republican Party's, approval tanking with the working class, would lead to the rise of a president so influential to the party shifts that he would bring about the fifth party system. Imagine being so influential as a person that you're known by your initials. Like, there are people who do partial initials, like Mary J. Blige, and then they're just like, oh, we're going all the way, baby. Anywho, we're going to be talking about the transition into the fifth party system. At this point, we've already established a tension going on in the Democratic Party because some people in the party don't like giving black people rights. But now we're going to talk about the period that kind of officially shunned this group out of the party. Starting with FDR, post-Lincoln for over 70 years, the Democratic Party only won 4 of the 18 presidential elections. Then Franklin D. Roosevelt came along and decided he was going to serve those 4 Democratic presidential terms in 12 years, partially in spirit. His New Deal policies heavily targeted both civil rights and urban renovation, both of which heavily affected the black community since they recently went through a mass migration to the cities. These policies were so influential to oppressed communities like black people, along with the general working class, that a New Deal coalition was formed in support of FDR, which would lead to him being elected for the rest of his life. FDR obviously didn't cause the civil rights movement to happen. Like, he was a white guy who, while did some good for the civil rights movement, ignored the needs of domestic and agricultural workers, which were heavily dominated by the black community, and also ignored literal anti-lynching bills when everyone, including his literal wife, was telling him to promote them. Anyway, while FDR didn't cause the civil rights movement, his expansion of the federal government allowed future presidents to help more during the civil rights movement than they might have previously been able to. That's where JFK comes in. The civil rights movement sparked up just before his presidency, and he would be the first non-incumbent president to be voted in during this time period, so the black vote was essential for that time. Not because black people deserve rights, but because they were being loud. So now I guess we have to cater to them, right? Regardless, this was especially important since it was post-Civil Rights Act of 1957, which put penalties on denying people the right to vote. Note this really only increased black voter turnout in the North because no one was trying to police that kind of stuff down South. John F. Kennedy would become very chummy with black civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King, doing things like breaking him out of prison late into his 1960 presidential run. JFK's brother, Robert Kennedy, would also organize a racial relations meeting with black activists, including James Baldwin. That conference didn't go as well. He would end up alienating them, telling them he couldn't understand why they didn't want to fight in Vietnam or for a country that doesn't serve them, and, I'm not kidding, tried to make his experience as a white Irish Catholic comparable to being black in America. Despite that, JFK would be elected as president, and as the racial turmoil only increased during his presidency, JFK would initially be hesitant to make any big sweeping changes that improve the lives of black people, because even though the official Dixiecrats were no more, the South was still voting blue, and he didn't want to isolate the racist white Southern vote. But then he realized, wait, hold on, civil rights are a moral issue, not a political one, because, like, black people deserve rights because they're people. So he would publicly address the nation, telling the U.S. this, and propose the Civil Rights Act of 1963. Then he died. In comes LBJ, who would finish JFK's work and schmooze Congress into putting the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into writing. This, along with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, cemented the Democratic Party's reputation for being pro-civil rights. And the South would not be happy about that. And we'll see going into the next 2 decades how the South was finally converted to red. Now with the Democratic Party shift finalized, it's time to move our focus to the Republican Party. And boy, did they know how to capitalize on the political restlessness that had been forming in the South. So much so that the party's strategy has its own name, The Southern Strategy. Though popularized with Richard Nixon, the strategy did not start nor end with him. It officially started during the election of 1964 with Barry Goldwater. FDR's policies had converted many Democrats to Republicans with the Dixiecratic movement, but Goldwater was planning on taking those changes and exacerbating them. A very extreme white supremacist, Goldwater strongly opposed the Civil Rights Act, heavily promoted states' rights, and stated that the country should go back to the way things were. That definitely wouldn't echo through the party for years to come. The South would love this sentiment, and the Solid South would all collectively vote red for the first time in U.S. history. The rest of the country was kind of moving away from being explicitly racist, so other than Goldwater's home state, Arizona, everyone else would vote for LBJ. But this was proof that the waves of change had finally crashed down on the South. Being staunchly racist in this country wasn't going to work anymore, which is why post-Goldwater, dog whistle politics began exploding. For those who don't know, dog whistling is a term used in politics where a candidate uses subtlety and coded language to get support of a certain group without isolating or provoking the rest of the population. In this case, the humans who can't hear the whistle are the general U.S. population, and the dogs are racist. And this was a perfect time to start using dog whistling because while the Republican Party was garnering support in the U.S. at the time, there was another red party that was causing a lot of fear throughout the population. That's right, it's Red Scare time, baby. Because what better way to handle the fear of a foreign threat in the general public than by exploiting this fear and using it to pin people against each other? The Red Scare and tension between the doves and hawks of the Vietnam War led for a perfect time for Richard Nixon to appear in the country. His presidency wouldn't be about race, no, even though it definitely was. I mean, like, half of his policies are related to social welfare and integration, or should I say the delayment of integration? No, Nixon's presidency was about law and order. The Democrats were out of control with all these riots, drugs, giving black people rights, I mean, acting all communist. But yeah, with the Vietnam War splintering the Democratic Party once again, with the American Independent Party forming as basically the second coming of the Dixiecrats, Nixon was able to dominate both of his elections, all while not bringing attention to the fact that he was a raging white supremacist until, Watergate. While Nixon had done his work with the Southern Strategy, it just wasn't enough. I mean, the South voted blue during the 1976 election. Though that was mostly due to the pardoning of Nixon on Ford's part, because pardoning a person who is now a very well-known white supremacist, white-collar criminal, not a good look. In comes Ronald Reagan. Reagan, being an avid supporter of Goldwater during his presidential campaign, and being a schmoozy actor, was the perfect racist to master the art of dog whistling. You can even see him starting to use it during Goldwater's campaign. Here, I'll be a translator. Here we see him pure just mocking the doves of the Vietnam War.
The ultimate in individual freedom consistent with law and order, or down to the ant-heap of totalitarianism. And regardless of their sincerity, their humanitarian motives, those who would trade our freedom for security have embarked on this downward course.
Doing the whole, we're not oppressing you, it's your own fault, and you're making excuses shtick.
We have so many people who can't see a fat man standing beside a thin one without coming to the conclusion the fat man got that way by taking advantage of the thin one.
And of course, just calling Democrats socialists.
The Cold War will end through our acceptance of a not undemocratic socialism. Another voice says the profit motive has become outmoded. It must be replaced by the incentives of the welfare state. Or our traditional system of individual freedom is incapable of solving the complex problems of the 20th century.
He would lose the Republican primaries in 1976, mostly because he just blatantly said he was Goldwater's heir and shunned forced integration. Dang, you were doing so well in 1964. What happened to your dog whistle charm? He would pick up that slack again, though, and made it past the primaries in 1980. During his campaign, he would preach states' rights, his motive pretty obvious when he would make a states' rights speech in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where 3 civil rights activists were murdered by the KKK in 1964. And with that, Reagan would become president, and oh boy, was he a major segregationist and white supremacist during his time there, what with opposing busing for school integration, condemning affirmative action, the war on drugs, and of course, the war on drugs. And that's where we are today. The Southern strategy, started by Goldwater, promoted by Nixon, and cemented by Reagan, cemented the modern Republican Party as one of Southern ideals, aka white supremacy and racism. And with all of that, I have condensed a century-long political switch into a 10-minute video.
Psych!
Like most things in this country, the underlying answer to why this political switch happened comes down to race. With the Republican Party, we have a party born in one of the most racialized periods of the country, essentially being formed as the party of the Union. But after the Civil War and Reconstruction ended, the party seemingly decided that it had done enough for black people. That, and the party being so closely tied to the North and therefore industry, resulting in their wallets exploding during the technological revolution, resulted in a party more concerned with the economy than social reform heading into the 20th century. Taking that and running with it, Barry Goldwater began to propose a return to the past for the country, where states could do what they pleased, where they could continue to treat black people like second-class citizens, as our founding fathers intended. The Republican Party loved that idea, not necessarily the treating black people like second-class citizens part, but right of the state means more freedom of economy. And with Nixon capitalizing off the Vietnam War and the Red Scare, and the schmoozy dog-whistling Reagan, they were able to appeal to the past ideals so well that the Solid South changed from blue to red. As for the Democratic Party, they were originally the party that staunchly tried to protect slavery and opposed every piece of legislation related to civil rights during the Reconstruction era. Despite the party's original efforts, the black vote was finally becoming a big chunk of the voting population heading into the 20th century. And now with a Democratic Party that rarely got voted in and a wounded Republican Party thanks to Hoover, FDR saw an opportunity to reconstruct the party, focusing on urban reconstruction during the Great Depression and putting into place a bigger federal government that worked better with social reform. This led perfectly into the civil rights movement, where the Democratic Party solidified themselves as the new party of social reform by JFK and LBJ, working with black activists and signing important civil rights legislation into law, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964. These changes have stuck heading into modern times. The sentiments of Southern ideals have definitely echoed throughout the Republican Party, with a lot of right-leaning parts of government taking away the rights of oppressed identities, and the Democratic Party is trying their best to keep them, though the country's government leaning red right now isn't really helping. Right now, we're kind of in a new age Reconstruction era where we had a substantial movement of giving black people rights, and we're trying to give them more, but a certain party's control of government is making it really hard to. The difference is that party is red instead of blue now.